Today I want to walk you through a pretty simple process. For those of you that always have your A&P change your tire or your tube, this is something you can do, and then you can work with your A&P to double check your work and log it in your logbook. And I just want to show you some simple, easy steps to changing a tire and tube on your aircraft. This will be similar across most aircraft, and so also love your feedback. Go ahead and put your comments in the comments section. If you see something you might actually do different, but I'd love to hear your feedback. So first off, I've actually got my tire off. I'm changing out some 850s to a new 850. They are worn on one side. I didn't rotate them quick enough, and so it's kind of caused it on the other side to have a little bit more of a to it. So even with it flipped, the brake pad wants to touch. So I'm going to put a new set of 850s on. So I'll walk you through. I've already taken the tire and wheel off my airplane, so it's already off and secure. So here we go with step number one. Okay, so step number one, I've actually got my 850 off my Cessna 182. What you're going to want to do is, depending on the actual hub that you have or wheel, you might have 2 bolts, you might have 3, you could have 5 if you're running a 10. But right now this is a 6 and it's got 3 bolts. So you want to get the correct wrench and for the front and back. You'll need to hold the nut plates on the back, which are back here. Here's your disc, and you'll have your actual bolts right here. And so you're going to want to make sure that you've got the right socket and wrench. And then I put the wrench on the back, and then I use my socket to just loosen up the front. So, and I've already loosened these up for time's sake. So I'm going to spin mine off. And there's one set. Here comes my next one. And while I'm doing this, kind of one step that I didn't talk about, I actually deflated my tire. If you do this without deflating your tire, what will happen is you loosen these up. There's so much pressure pushing out that it'll actually snap your bolt out the back. So make sure that you take your valve stem out initially, let all the pressure out, and you can see that's already letting some of the talcum powder out from a previous change in there. So I'm going to take these out. And I'm just about got it. Doing this on the bed of a truck, so I have something I don't have to bend over. Okay, here we go. I'm going to pop my bolts out. There's 1. There's 2. And there's 3. And what you'll notice, once you do that, off comes your brake hub right here. This gives you a chance to inspect it, look for warping, look for any abnormalities, any cracks. You can go ahead and check it and make sure that it's exactly how it should be. And if you had some problem, that's when you talk to your A&P if you see something right now. But we still have good thickness, everything looks good, and there's no nicks or gouges or anything that I can see that would cause me to want to worry. So we're set there. Okay, so the next is what your hub looks like. It's got 2 parts to it, and that's going to have popped my bottom piece off. Let's see if we can get this top one to go. There's our top piece. It's free. Just push that valve stem. You can see, there we go. There's our top piece. It's off. This also gives you, hey, check that out. There's a daddy long leg in there. Gives you a chance to inspect your hubs and make sure that they're good and greased. Your bearings, excuse me. And now's a good time to actually repack them and make sure that your bearings are packed and ready to go. So we'll set that aside. Looks like we've got some talcum powder here. I'm just going to lift that up, and out comes my bottom. So you can see the color. That's where that brake hub was sitting. The disc brake is sitting in there. So you can inspect this, see how it looks, make sure everything is good, look for cracks. And then I'm going to probably put some grease inside my bearings as well. I'll re-grease those just before I put it back on, just to make sure I've got plenty of grease in there. Okay. So this next step right here, we simply want to pull our tube out. And I like to get in here and I'm just going to press and get as much air as I can out so that I'm not ripping a full tube out. And if your tube is still good, it's perfectly fine to use it again. There are some people that'll replace both at the same time. It's kind of an expensive replace, but I'll inspect the tube, and if there was no leak or any problem before, as long as I've had good talcum powder in there and the tube looks like there's no wear spots where it's rubbed, I'm going to inspect it. Then I would say you're good to use it again. So you just kind of work your tube out, work that air out. And I'm careful of the valve stem. I don't want to grab the valve stem, and I've already got it out. And there's my tube. So I can inspect this tube, and I'm going to look for any wear spots on here and just see if it looks good, if there's anything that looks funny, where it got a hot spot or it was rubbing and chattering. That looks good. This is my old tire, and you know, it's worn funny, and for some reason it would not fit. The brake pad would touch once we rotated it. And so unfortunately this one is going to come off. So, okay, I'll show you how we reassemble next. Okay, so we got our tire apart and our wheel and tire separate. I got my brand new tire here. And here's what I'm going to do. First step is I'm going to actually line the inside with some talcum powder, and then I'm going to re-talcum up my tube. And so I'll take my talc and I'm actually just going to pour it, open it up, and I'm going to put just, you can see I'm putting a bit in there. So I'm going to set my talc in there. Then I'm going to roll this around for a while, and I want to get that talc to cover that tire. Make sure that it's got a nice coating so that it's slick in there. And you can feel it. Once you put the talc in there, you can really feel that it starts to pick up some smoothness and some slickness. And I pretty much have got that entirely coated with talc. All right, so I've got my talc in there. Next step here, I'll put a little bit of talc on my hands, and I'm just going to try to recoat my tube just a little bit on both sides. And I just want the tube with plenty of talc on it so that when I lay it in there, it's nice and smooth. And then I'll just make sure that it's good. You can feel now there's plenty of talc. There's talc inside the tire, there's talc on the tube. So now I'm just going to take and press my air out of this. And you're going to put your tube in here. Just work it in nice and slow. Tuck it back up in there. You'll hear the air coming back out. I'll get her tucked in here. Talk about next steps. So, and then I'm just going to spin the tube. I'm going to kind of spin it because I want it to untuck itself. If I folded it anywhere, I'll reach around and I can actually feel in here everywhere I put it, and I can see that I can actually feel there's no fold. It's kind of a mess, but you'd rather have a little talc on your tire. If you don't put enough talcum in there, your tube can rub, stick, and wear right through almost instantly. Okay, so we've got our talc. The tube is talc, the tire's talked. She's good. I'm going to line my stem up with my mark on the tire for my heavy spot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually now run my compressor, and I'll show you that next. I'm going to inflate my tire, but I'm not going to put the valve stem in all the way. And I'm going to inflate it. Then I'm going to let the air back out of it, and I'll show you that next. Got to go pressure up the compressor. Okay, so we're ready. Compressor's ready to go. What I've done is I put my valve stem back in, but I'm not going to leave it in right now. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to slowly add some pressure in this, and I'm going to let it pump up and seat itself. And what I want it to do is if there's any folds, they're going to unfold. I don't want to have my wheel in here right now and you have a crease or a fold, and when you inflate it, that fold gets trapped, and that's a wear spot that will immediately give you problems. So looks like we're good. Everything feels good. The tube is the same on both sides. It looks correct on the inside. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove my valve stem. There's my valve stem. You can see all I did was put enough pressure just to get the tube to inflate, and now I can still move it around. So I'm looking for proper shape. I want everything shaped the correct way before I go on to the next step. So let's talk about, now that you've got your hub apart, you can actually grease your bearings. And here's what I've done. There's two ways of doing it. You can take your C-clip out right here. If your bearings have not been greased lately, take the entire bearing assembly out, clean it, and grease it. Mine, I keep greased. And so what I've done is taken some fresh grease and I've just pressed it into the bearings, pressed it in there, and then cleaned it up. So there's new grease pressed inside those bearings, and it starts to squish out when you do it. And so if your bearings are dry, take them off, clean them in a solvent, then repack them, put the C-clip back in. If you maintain yours on a regular basis, you can just press some grease back in there. You'll feel it packed tight, and then you've got them re-greased, and that's a step you can follow. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next step, and that is we're going to assemble our wheel, and this is an important step. First thing I'm going to do, put a little bit of talc on and I'm going to just talc up this inside here. I don't want a whole lot on there, but I want some so that when this tire or the wheel goes on, we don't have any sticky spots in there. And again, check it, make sure you don't have any binding on that tube. Just talc it up. So I'm going to take my back side. This is my brake side. The valve stem is on the other side, my disc side. And I'm just going to slide that in. And this is where, once we start inflating, we'll get it to seal. But for right now, I'm just going to try to get a little seal on there so when I flip it over, it doesn't want to drop out. And then this is where we got to be really careful. We need this tube tucked up and away. And you're going to tuck it kind of around that wheel. You can kind of see that what I'm doing is tucking it here so that the shape is correct. You don't want your tube getting bound inside here. That's really critical right here, making sure that this does not get bound when you put the other half of your wheel on. Super, super important. So take your time right here, feel around, make sure everything is shaped correctly. And now, we'll set this down, and I still have some talc, and I'll just rub it right here, because what I want to have happen is when I inflate this, I want this inflation to seat my wheels. So I'm going to feed my valve stem right down through the valve stem opening and work myself down into here. And this is critical right here, that you do not pinch, that you don't pinch your tire, your tube. So I'm going to work this up in there, and then I'll rework the back on. I want to make sure that this one is, with the valve stem, is seated really good. And then I'll do the same thing. I'll recheck, and I'll situate the tube. And I'm going to try to visually line up my holes. And they're touching right now. Next step is just put your brake cover on. Excuse me, your disc brake. And I'm just setting it in place. I'm just going to try to line up my bolts, excuse me, and have them go through and meet on the other side. And this is where, if you get it lined up, and it's going to pop right through. So I know that right now that my tube is good, it's not pinched. See that one just lined up right there? My third one is going to come right through. Everything's lined up. I'm going to put my washers and my nuts on each one. I'm not going to crank them right now. I'm going to thread them down finger tight, because what I want to do is get this to kind of pop and seal first before I do that. Because sometimes if you pinch it down, if you crank it down, what happens is that tube, the tire actually gets bound up on the wheel and it won't seat itself correctly. So I'm going to seat it, and then I'm going to let the air back out. Then I'm going to tighten everything up, but I'll bring these down to where they're snug. So they've been put on to where they're, you know, the threads are almost coming through, so that it doesn't do any damage to the threads. But then I'm going to inflate it until they both pop up. Then that tire is properly seated. So we'll get that done. Whoops. Okay, valve stem's in. Now this is where you want to go slow. I want to hold my valve stem, inflate a bit. You're going to hear air pressure blowing out of here, because as this inflates, it's pushing air out. And it may not sound correct at first, so I'm going to let it do that and let it start to seat. You can see it's already starting to push itself up. I make sure that my valve stem is still square and straight. It's pushing itself. Oh, it's almost seated. You can see right now it's almost seated front, and the rear is almost seated. I'm just going to keep pushing it up until it seats itself all the way up. Then I'm going to check it, and I'm going to look to make sure there's no gaps and everything looks. You can actually see the factory line. You can see that factory line of where it's supposed to seat. And if you look, then I'm going to take, and I'm actually going to let my valve stem back out, because now I've got it seated. And my next step is going to be torquing it down. Now what you don't want to do, this is letting the air out. What you don't want to do now is push down on your tire. You've actually got the bead seated. You'll see some space there, and it'll release a little pressure. This also gives me one last chance just to double check everything, and you can see the seat line right here coming around, which should pretty much line up with the inside groove of your wheel. I now know I've got it set, so now I'm going to torque everything down. I'm actually going to bring myself down and get it snug. Then I'll add just a little bit of pressure to where things come up, and then I'll torque. And that way I know that I haven't pinched my tire or the tire down. And if you do that, you'll get a wobble as you're going. The tire will actually have a hop in it. So once you've got that done, torqued, you're ready to go. Now, here's what I recommend. Once you've done all this, have your A&P come over, which I will do here in just a little bit. I'll walk over and bring him out of his hangar, and I'll tell him exactly what I've done. This is where I'm at. Check the torque specs on the tire. And at that point, you're ready to reinstall on your aircraft. And that's as simple as it is right there. Give it a go. Best thing to do very first time is do it under the guidance of your A&P, and he can walk you through the steps, and then you're pretty good. Now this is great for light aircraft and sport aircraft. It's an easy way to do it. Then you need to have you and your A&P. He can show you how to log it in your aircraft logbook, so that it shows dates and times of what you did and who performed the work. And then you're ready to go.